Yeah, I'm excited. I think when I think about Nebraska on all fronts, academically, they're in the AAU, which and every school in the Big Ten has that classification. So they fit academically, athletically. They have a great history and tradition. It makes sense from a business model standpoint, financially, and then culturally, it makes sense. So yeah, it's an exciting day.
Does it stop here? I mean, that's the question everyone's asking now.
I'll leave that to the commissioner to say unequivocally, but from day one, he said we're going to go through a 12 to 18 month process. I think it's possible it stops here, but I'll also let him talk about whether or not there is a possibility that it could continue.
Have you talked to people in Lincoln in the department there? I mean, your counterparts?
A little bit, just today, just to kind of talk about whether or not this was really going to happen, and but nothing in any link.
Why is this happening now? We've heard so much talk, but now everything just seems to be unfolding daily.
I think that's a fair question. I think, again, the commissioner, by the way, really appreciate the commissioner's leadership. He laid out about a year ago a plan for us. He said it would be a 12 to 18 month process. I think we were on that pace. And then, we all started to hear things about what might happen in the Pac-10. A day ago, we hear that Colorado's going into the Pac-10 and that there might be other movement. And so I know he didn't change the strategy, he didn't change the principles, but Nebraska was interested, they wanted to apply, and so that's why it happened now, maybe partly because of Nebraska's interest to do something sooner rather than later.
What's kind of gone through your mind as you've kind of seen all this unravel here in the last few days, with starting with all the rumors that were out there about Nebraska joining and then up to this point with them?
Well, what's gone through my mind, I go back to the very beginning. I'm not a big one to say, change for change's sake is good, but change to make yourself better, and that's what the commissioner described about a year ago, is if we can find somebody that academically, athletically, financially, and culturally makes sense. And I go back to when Penn State joined the conference. I think all of us sat there and said, if we could find a fit that makes as much sense as Penn State has, then let's take a look at it. Well, now that I fast forward to today, I look at what Nebraska brings, and what goes through my mind is I know we found an institution that fits all of those and makes sense.
In the release that was sent out a short while ago, you touched on in there about the whole thing with the rivalry with Iowa and Nebraska. Just how much bigger do you feel that that's going to become now? Like, you have the fan base that Iowa has, you have what Nebraska's fan base is like.
Well, the first thing that I represent is a member of the Big Ten Conference, and so from the Big Ten Conference standpoint, as I've said, it makes sense. Now, move ahead to Iowa specifically, and because they're right next door, because our fans will be able to drive back and forth. All of our teams, we have 24 sports, and the easy trip back and forth from Iowa City to Lincoln or Lincoln to Iowa City. I think it's going to be a terrific rivalry. I think we get sort of the win-win. Not only are they a great addition to the conference, but they're a great rivalry automatically for our fans, for our student athletes. So I'm looking forward to that.
Specifically with the football game, is that something that you would want to see maybe be like an annual game at the end of the year, kind of like what you have right now with Minnesota or Wisconsin?
I think we're way ahead of the cart's way ahead of the horse on that one. Simply from the standpoint that they just were announced a few minutes ago that they're a member, so we haven't had any discussions about where they might fit in the rotation. But the part I have thought about, we have played each other in football historically. We've played each other in many sports historically, and I've thought about that factor, and I think again that's going to be positive for our fans, our student athletes, our coaches.
There's no messing around with this. I mean, they're going to be on the schedule next year in all the sports. Can you talk about that timeline? I mean, this is not, okay, it's going to be 2 years, 3 years. I mean,
the only thing I can tell you about the timeline is generally the last few days I've known that that's going to be the timeline, but we haven't had any discussions about how to integrate that in, and that'll all start. I think maybe they'll give us the weekend off, but I'm sure it'll happen fast, where we'll have to start talking about how is this going to fit into the current schedules that we have.
How does this impact, say, the non-conference opponents that you would have, say, for football next year? Because obviously that schedule's been in place for a while, but now with adding Nebraska in, that's obviously going to be a game Iowa plays. So,
What we don't know is how many games in conference we're going to play in. We haven't talked about that. We don't know what that's going to be like. So if we play the same number of conference games and just shift who it is we play, then our non-conference schedule won't be affected. If we play more conference games, that's when it would become a question and something we'd have to figure out.
As a Big Ten AD, are you concerned about the Big 12 at all, about the future of it, of this, saying this is just the beginning?
Well, my honest answer is, I have a lot of friends who work in the Big 12, so I've thought a little bit about what sounds like they're going through. The Big Ten expansion hasn't been about, whether or not we were going to raid another conference. It's been about what's best for the Big Ten, irregardless of where the schools come from. So I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that because we've been focused on what's going to make the Big Ten better. But I have some friends who work in the Big 12, so I've thought a couple of times about the uncertainty that conference seems to be under. I haven't spent any time. I really haven't talked to any of them.
More specifically off that, does it raise any concerns as far as Iowa State goes?
In what way?
And your relationship and the ability to play them and their membership in a conference?
I haven't thought or talked at all about their membership in a conference, nor have we talked at all about our rivalry. But the way I look at the rivalry is until I'm told that something's going to be different. I've said over time that I think the rivalry between Iowa and Iowa State is a good one. It's good for the state, good for college athletics. And so unless something changes in the makeup of my scheduling, my conference scheduling, I would anticipate that continuing. Now both Jamie and I put a contingency in the last contract that we put together that said if something occurs that doesn't allow us to play it like this anymore, that there is a way that we can deal with that. And we weren't being prophetic, we were just making a good business decision when we put a contract together.
Deal with that by continuing to play, regardless of conference shakeups?
No, not necessarily. That if something shook up in their conference or ours, and it affected the way we schedule non-conference games, that the contract could become void.
Okay.
But we both did that so that if it happened either way, it's something that, again, we weren't being prophetic. It just was a good business thing to put into the contract.
So in a circumstance that could create that.
I'm not even going to.
Okay.
At this point, there are no circumstances. Okay. We're scheduled out, and nothing that I'm aware of has changed. But again, remember, Nebraska joined us about 5 minutes ago, so we haven't had any discussions about.
So
changes.
just to be clear, then, as of now, playing Iowa State annually is still on, but there is a possibility that it might not become an annual.
Well, as of now, I've not learned anything that would change that, but I haven't thought beyond 5 minutes. So.
Conference championship game for football, has there been a discussion of sites for that?
No, there hasn't been a discussion of sites. There's been a general discussion about if a conference goes to 12 teams, obviously there's an opportunity there, but we haven't talked about details about where it would be, what the date would be, how we would go about it.
Reaction from coaches that you've talked to? Have you talked to any of them in the last day or two?
In general, I've talked to them, and in general, they think it makes sense for all the same reasons that I mentioned. That as I look through the different sports and all the teams that we've played over the years, for the most part, it's very competitive. I'm sure Sharon Dingman, our volleyball coach, she may or may not agree because Nebraska is one of the best volleyball programs in America. Obviously, we know their abilities in football, women's basketball. They had their best year ever, and Coach Yori was National Coach of the Year, and I could go all the way down the list. There's a lot of great programs, so it's going to make the conference better, which was the whole premise of what we were doing. Are they going to make us better in all those categories? And I feel like Nebraska certainly does that.
Have they talked to you or any of the other ADs at all about what it would look like as far as splitting up two divisions in the Big Ten, or is it something where it'd just be one conference?
We've had discussions without naming any schools over the last year. We've had discussions about what would a conference look like if we had 12, 14, 16. So we've had discussions about how all the scheduling would work if we had those types of a conference without any names attached to it over the last several months. Now we'll have to sit down. We have 12. If it stays 12, then we'll have to figure out how we're going to manage it with 12.
Is it something that's going to be geographical, kind of like the SEC is, where you have an East and a West, or is it going to be more like the ACC if there's two divisions?
If you ask me logically, that seems to make some sense, but we haven't come to any conclusions at all about how it might look.
With the geography part, as far as the Big 12, it seemed like that hurt